Hello and welcome, welcome everyone. Welcome to Open Circle online meeting with Stefan Boldian. Welcome to Working with Trauma on the Path of Awakening. My name is Sarah. I'm your Open Circle host for today. So I'm your go-to person for any practical questions that you may have about Zoom or about anything else practical. We're going to send the recording to everyone after the session, so you will receive it. You don't need to request it in any special way. Yeah, we have 2 hours together. It's really beautiful to be here and really beautiful to see all of you joining together with us. And just a practical note, I'm going to record only Stefan's video and only your audio if you're asking questions. So your video is not going to be recorded. Yeah, I think that's all for now from me. And I wish everyone really fruitful and beautiful 2 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great. Thank you for orchestrating everything. So, yeah, let's just wait a minute or two more. So a few more people may join. Then we'll do a little guided meditation. Okay, and then I'll talk a little bit, and then we can have a dialogue. We'll just wait a few more minutes. Okay, let's start then, shall we? So let's begin we'll do a little guided meditation. I know most of you have a meditation practice of some kind, a sitting practice, just to guide you a bit here. So allow your awareness to drop out of the head, where it's so often localized, and then let it drop, just let it drop gently into the heart. And from the heart center, allow awareness to open. The awareness is innately open, but we can invite it to let go of any boundaries and just open to what is just the way it is, not from the head, but from the heart. And at the deepest level, the heart is always open, allowing, welcoming what is. when the mind comes in and judges or rejects, discriminates. So open to whatever arises in your experience right now. No picking and choosing. No holding on or rejecting. Just open to what is. Much of the time in meditation, we're looking for some special state. Trying to be peaceful or happy or whatever state we may covet. Now just open to whatever arises. And in particular, allow whatever troublesome or difficult or so-called negative emotions might be lurking somewhere in your psyche or your heart to emerge into the light, to love without rejection, giving complete space, welcoming what arises. Again, the world is welcoming. There's a warm, affectionate quality to the awareness. And this too. And this too. Notice any tendency to shy away or push away or judge. And just continue to allow an open, non-judgmental, affectionate space, whatever wants to be experienced. You might ask yourself, what have I been avoiding? What have I been pushing away? And deliberately invite that into your experience as well. As Rumi says, the dark thought, the shame, the malice, the fear, the anger, whatever it is, allow it into the body, allow it into the heart. Nothing is alien here, nothing is unwelcome here. Allowing even the boundaries between yourself and your experience to fall away. Just this. No separate someone experiencing it. Separate experience, just this. This heart that we're pointing to, that we're experiencing, doesn't belong to you or to me. It's the heart. Includes and contains, embraces you and me, self, and other. Feel yourself being held in the heart. The heart, the boundaries between self and other, inside and outside, all away. Okay, let's let go of any deliberate meditation, but just allow yourself to rest in this heartful openness, which again is not personal. On a personal level, we may feel various blocks and boundaries and barriers, seemingly, but in this deepest place, which we all share, there is inherent openness, inherent embrace of all of our experience, all that arises. Huh? So that beautiful Rumi poem, A Guest House, huh? This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, joy, depression, and meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. That's the nature of the heart. Welcome and entertain them all. So we're going to be exploring a little about the heart, and particularly around the issue of trauma. It's a very sensitive subject, a subject that many of us are familiar with through our own experience. I'm certainly not an expert in trauma, but I've worked as a psychotherapist and also as a teacher with many people who've been dealing with trauma, often early life trauma. And I've noticed certain things that I wanted to share in a satsang, and then also talk about a little how to work with trauma from the perspective of awakening, and how trauma, and in particular PTSD, affects sometimes, not always, but can affect the awakening process and the integration of awakening. Because I think there are some important insights to share that also may be helpful if you've experienced trauma in your own kind of navigation of the journey of awakening. Okay, I think there's something unique about relating to the process of awakening, having been traumatized, having experienced trauma, and having some, we'll call it PTSD. PTSD, of course, has a history. We think of it in terms of, let's say, the Vietnam War, or victims of rape or violent crime. But I think it's important to recognize that you don't have to have experiences that are that extreme to have some measure of PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress, right? So let me talk a little about, first of all, what is trauma? And I don't usually refer to notes, but I will, because there's content here. Usually it's just coming spontaneously, but there is some content here that I think is important. I mean, for one thing, I think that trauma is a strong motivator. Suffering is a strong motivator. Can I see people and not myself? Is that possible? Let me see here.
Yes, there's gallery view. You should be.
Okay, that's good. I don't know how that happened. I was on gallery view, but suddenly I was just seeing myself. I want to see you guys. Okay, so suffering is a great motivator. It's what spurs us on to look more deeply, right? To question consensus reality, to wonder about the deepest questions, right? Who am I? What is truth? What is reality? And of course, trauma is intense suffering. So in that sense, trauma seems to really be a great spur on the journey, you know. And I think it's very common for, I think, a large percentage of people who come to this awakening process are people who've been traumatized to a greater or lesser degree. And in my description, I think you noticed that I quoted my first Zen teacher. When I was interested in becoming a monk, he said, you know, monasteries are places for desperate people. And I think that's what he was talking about. You know, those of us who come to this are often desperate in some way or another. We tried other things, it hasn't worked, we're not happy, and we're seeking some deeper abiding happiness, right? So that makes total sense. In that sense, trauma and awakening go hand in hand, you know. You know, at the same time, I think there can be a certain impact of trauma on the awakening process. And in particular, I think those who have been traumatized, and again, this is not true for everyone, but those who've been traumatized, and again, let me before I go on, let me define what trauma is, right? Trauma is generally caused by the experiences that are overwhelming to our nervous system, and in which we feel as if our survival or integrity, physical, emotional, psychological, is at stake, is in jeopardy. We feel somehow threatened with annihilation or complete overwhelm. And it's experiences like that that tend to trigger trauma. Now, there are greater or lesser degrees of trauma, of course. Someone who is abused as a child, very often that's an extreme trauma because you're small, you're defenseless, and if that's repeated, that creates certain patterns in the nervous system that I'll talk about. But even as an adult, if you are, let's say, attacked, or you're in a car accident, you can be traumatized, right? Because you feel like your life is at stake. And then subsequent events that are similar to that event may trigger fear, may trigger reactivity, may trigger rage, may trigger some kind of just a sense of insecurity, right? If that happens repeatedly, that's what PTSD is. PTSD is the tendency to be triggered by events that resemble the events that were traumatic for us. So, for example, if you were in a car accident in which you felt your life was at stake, you almost got killed, or certainly the car was out of control and you were afraid for your life, then driving for you for a while, or even indefinitely, can be a scary proposition, because certain stimuli resemble what happened when you felt your survival was at stake. So people who've been traumatized tend to be hypervigilant. They can tend to lack a certain basic trust that things are going to work out for the best, or that they're going to work out at all, because that wasn't your experience. So that's a kind of almost a demarcation between those who've been traumatized and those who haven't. There are people who I actually got a Facebook post from Facebook friends whom I met in the UK, who said, "What about those of us who haven't been traumatized? Or can we wake up too?" I said, "Wait a second. We've all been traumatized to a greater or lesser degree, but I think there's a certain almost demarcation. Those of us who've been traumatized experienced." I'm seeing a cat's eyes looking at me on the. Beth, your cat is interested in your computer or camera there. It's almost like we've experienced had a level of experience that people who haven't been traumatized haven't. And people who've been traumatized often have a certain level of fear that those who haven't been traumatized don't. And so entering into the awakening process, there can be a tendency to compare ourselves to other people and say, wait a second, I'm having certain kinds of fears and distrust, hypervigilance, I can't relax. What's wrong with me? I've been practicing meditation for years. I've had some awakenings. Why is this still happening to me? And there can be a tendency to judge that I've seen in a lot of the people that I work with. I've seen my true nature. I've awakened to who I really am. I feel these are genuine experiences, and I spend periods of time in non-dual presence. Really open to what is, not feeling a sense of separation, and suddenly something will trigger a trauma reaction, again, a PTSD reaction, and suddenly I'm in fear again. Suddenly I'm not trusting. Or certain kinds of situations, I start becoming really kind of hypervigilant and fixated on certain stimuli, certain elements of the situation. I lose the global view. I lose the openness. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I contract. Everything gets really narrow. My vision becomes tunnel vision, and I'm looking around me for the threat, for what might happen. What happened? Where did that go? I woke up, I know who I am, but what happened? So I think it's important for us to recognize that there is something unique about having experienced trauma and having some degree of post-traumatic stress that can affect not only the awakening process, but also the integration of awakening into our lives, living from awakening on a moment-to-moment basis, right? So having been traumatized, we're sensitized in a certain way to certain kinds of stimuli, okay, that will trigger us in irrational, quote unquote, irrational, unexpected, unpredictable ways. And will also have the capacity to jolt us out of the experience of oneness, of no separation, of flow, into a much more constricted and narrow state of mind. Okay. And at the same time, also something I've also noticed with people who've been traumatized is there's a tendency. This is a bit psychological here, but a tendency to have. See, we all have parts of ourselves. We're not singular. We have child parts and adult parts. And, these are sub-personalities, they're sometimes called. And pretty much everyone has them. Back in the 70s, it was transactional analysis. Your adult, your parent, and your child. And there have been many systems of thought that have described this. But I think in particular, when you've been traumatized, there are often parts that are, how shall I say, that are still have a strong hold on us and are difficult. They don't wake up necessarily when the rest of the psyche seems to wake up. There are parts of us like child parts, for example. Let's say the traumatized child. If we were traumatized as a child, this child part may get triggered. And even though in most of our being, there's this spaciousness and this openness and this trust, there is this part that gets triggered in certain situations that knows nothing of this awakening, is actually has a sense of being like almost a separate little self, Again, this is not necessarily multiple personality, but there is a certain level of dissociation or separation that these parts experience. And so the journey of integrating these parts can be a much more involved and a much slower process than it might be for someone who hasn't experienced trauma in that way and doesn't have these what might be called encapsulated or dissociated parts. Now this is of course getting very psychological, but I think many of you can relate to this. I think probably all of us can relate to this to some degree or other. Suddenly you're in a situation where someone is treating you the way your mother or father treated you, and you just get enraged, right? Or you get really frightened. Where did that come from? How come that part doesn't experience the awakeness, the no separation, the sense of open-heartedness and connection that the rest of the psyche experiences, right? So I think it's important to recognize this so we don't compare ourselves with those who've awakened and it seems to have been for them a very smooth and uncomplicated process. For us, it may be more involved, more psychologically complicated. Huh? And as I'll talk about in a bit, what I think is really important in all of this is a great degree of compassion and a great degree of, again, welcoming all of our psyche, all of ourselves, all of ourselves into our experience without rejecting or judging. Huh? So it's also important to recognize that awakening itself doesn't necessarily heal all the splits in the psyche. You know, these might be called splits in the psyche. There are parts of us here, you know, and then there's all of this awakeness. But then, you know, sometimes it's called chakras, right? The lower chakras, sometimes the way it's talked about. There are places in our first and second chakras where we hold fear, we hold disconnection. And the awakening may not extend immediately or for quite a while down into these unintegrated, dissociated, disconnected parts of ourselves. Huh? So this may be an ongoing process. Okay, awakening may be instantaneous, right? We have a profound glimpse of who we are, which cuts through a lot of our illusions and gives us a sense that may last for days or weeks or months of being at one with reality, moving through life without any impediment, feeling one with the flow. And then suddenly, again, we find ourselves back in old patterns. So again, a tremendous amount of compassion. See, I think what's important to recognize is that trauma actually affects the brain. So, you know, the connection between consciousness and the brain is a very interesting and controversial and subtle one, and maybe ultimately unanswerable. You know, consciousness certainly doesn't reside in the brain, but there is certainly some connection between the brain and consciousness. One way people talk about it is the brain is more like a receiving station, like you know, a tuning station, receiving signals rather than generating them. But in any case, as I saw with my dear friend Suzanne Siegel, whose brain tumor disconnected her from her true nature, as many of us saw with Jean Klein, who, because he had a series of strokes and had dementia in his later years, would get very agitated with people and act in ways that were seemingly unawakened. But of course, his brain had been affected. So trauma also affects the brain. One of the ways it affects the brain is it literally reduces the size of the hippocampus. Hippocampus is the part of the brain that deals with memory and helps us distinguish the present from the past, right? So with a hippocampus that isn't operating optimally, we can actually mistake what's happening in the present for the past. Flashbacks, which are common in PTSD. Sensitization, feeling like what's happening now is like what happened to us when we were children or when we were attacked. Another part of the brain that's affected is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that helps us integrate and, how shall I say, relate to and deal with the difficult emotions that arise. So there are parts of the brain where the difficult emotions are generated. Then there's this prefrontal cortex that helps us relate to them and integrate them and work with them in the moment. This part is also reduced. So the negative emotions are generated, we don't know how to contain them. Okay. And then the amygdala, the part of the brain that generates particularly fear and other so-called negative or difficult emotions, is heightened, it's activated. So this combination makes us, those of us who've been traumatized, more, to have more difficulty dealing with reactive emotions. The brain has been affected. Now, the brain, it can be changed. In the last 20 years or so, a tremendous amount of research has shown that the brain is actually quite plastic, quite malleable. Neuroplasticity is now widely recognized, and even in the older brains, we can change these patterns. Meditation is one excellent way to mitigate the effects of trauma. Meditation or resting in non-dual presence, which is ultimately what meditation is pointing to, are very effective at mitigating the effects of trauma, which is why I generally recommend meditation for people, even though what I teach is the direct approach, pointing directly to the nature of who we really are. But I also feel that meditation is very helpful at so many levels. So regular meditation is very helpful with trauma. And what is probably one of the most helpful is a mutually loving and supportive relationship. Because people who've experienced the effects of trauma, trauma affects people differently. The same experience may have very different effects on different people. One of the things that mitigates the effect of trauma is what's called secure attachment, having a supportive, loving relationship with a significant other where we feel heard and contained and held and understood. Right? And this breeds what's called secure attachment. We feel our father or mother or both of them are there for us. And when we feel feelings, they help us learn how to contain them and hold them in a loving way. And then over time, we internalize that ability. We incorporate that. Many studies have shown that. We learn that from our significant other attachments, and then we internalize that ability. So when difficult emotions arise, let's say in a traumatic situation, we can deal with it, we can work with it, we can integrate it, we can hold it, we can digest it. Okay? So people who have that kind of attachment, say growing up, are able to deal with traumas much more skillfully. But those of us who didn't have that kind of secure attachment, which is so, many of us, if not most of us, it's more difficult. And trauma then gets imprinted in the nervous system. And one of the effects of trauma, actually, is to feel disconnected. Disconnected from ourselves, disconnected from others, disconnected from reality, isolated, cut off. Now, of course, what we're looking for in spiritual awakening is the exact opposite, right? We're looking for connection. We're looking for oneness. We're looking for a sense of being connected, deeply connected with our heart, with our true nature, intimately connected with others, to feel no separation. Trauma is the ultimate feeling of separation. PTSD is the ultimate feeling of separation. Okay. Awakening, you could say, is a powerful antidote to the effects of trauma, But at the same time, it's not the same as healing. By itself, it's not sufficient. So before awakening, after awakening, other skillful means are really helpful, if not necessary, in working with trauma. So I think it's really important for those of us who are both awakening and working with our trauma to know that awakening can be a powerful, skillful means, a powerful, it can transform trauma at a very deep level to a certain degree. Once you really know who you are, it may be that you don't take the emotions that arise seriously anymore. You don't get caught up in them as much as you used to. You don't identify with them the way you used to. And yet, still, you get triggered, right? The trauma hasn't completely gone away. Your relationship to the trauma has been transformed, but there are still parts of you, parts of the psyche that are being triggered, right? Awakening may not fully heal those splits, okay? That's been my experience. I've worked with people as a therapist with trauma. I use EMDR, there are other techniques with trauma. And awakening can help. It makes it move much more quickly. In my experience, working with people who've awakened to their true nature, working with trauma goes very quickly, much more quickly than it does with most people, because there's already this disidentification. There's already this ability to see it for what it is, but not get caught by it, right? So that in the work, in the trauma, it can move very quickly, but still that work often proves to be really helpful, again, if not necessary. I can't say that it's necessary, who knows, but very, very helpful. Right? So again, it's a different trajectory, we could say, for those of us who've experienced trauma. One of the things I noticed in my years of meditation and working with people as well is that, sometimes people use meditation as a way to dissociate, a way to avoid. It's called spiritual bypassing, right? But spiritual bypassing sounds like, something deliberate. It's usually much more unconscious than that. It's that we have, we experience a lot of negative emotion, fear, anger, emotions that we don't quite understand, that we have difficulty dealing with, regulating. And so we come to meditation as a way to handle them, to avoid them, to find peace and quiet, to create some sense of inner calm and tranquility, which is beautiful. But ultimately, like we were exploring in the meditation at the beginning, we need to turn around and welcome all this material that's kind of lurking in the shadows, right? Dogen, one of the great Zen masters, once said Zazen, Zen meditation, that he said, Zazen is dancing on the heads of devils. That's a very interesting image, right? Dancing on the heads of devils, right? What I think he meant was that, you're meditating above all this turmoil, that sounds like how he experienced it. He's meditating, and down below, in the lower chakras perhaps, there are all these demonic energies, right? Sounds like Dogen, who died at 53, by the way, hadn't done his integration work. Ultimately, those so-called demons or devils need to be welcomed into the light of awareness, into the love of the heart, the deep heart, as my friend John Prendergast calls it, the boundless heart. They need to be welcomed into the guest house, to be hosted in the guest house and welcomed and seen, experienced, and allowed to release in their own natural way. And that's especially true and especially difficult, I think, for those who have experienced trauma, because very often, as I mentioned, if you've experienced trauma, there may be parts of you that you're really not aware of and that are actually very far from consciousness. But eventually, and they seem to come out of nowhere. They seem to be what's called ego dystonic. In other words, they seem to be totally foreign when they arise often. It's like, how did that happen? But I'm really a calm person, nothing bothers me. I'm a meditator, I'm awake. And suddenly out of nowhere, wham, right? It's like, where did this come from? This doesn't feel like me, Very often split off parts, dissociated parts will come and be experienced in that way. So how do we welcome them? See, how can we allow these splits to be healed? That's where I think just awakening is not sufficient. There needs to be some other kind of process involved. Awakening is helpful, and it may free up much of this undigested, unintegrated material, but there will still be parts that come out of nowhere and surprise us. And I think it's important for us to know that this is not wrong. We haven't done anything wrong. It doesn't mean that our awakening has not been genuine or deep. It just means that because of our life experience, the process for us is more involved. It may take longer, and we may need some help with it, some therapeutic help, and not to be ashamed of that, and not to judge ourselves for that, but to welcome that as part of the whole process. It's one thing to wake up, as we know. It's another thing to live from this awakening from moment to moment. For some of us, having had the awakening is sufficient. That was beautiful. And now let's get on with life. But for many of us, perhaps most of us, there's a dedication to living from this awakening, to experiencing this no separation, this flow, this boundlessness in each moment with all kinds of situations. So if there's that kind of dedication, then there's a desire to integrate at every level of the psyche, in which case then there's some more work to be done. And to, again, welcome that. So welcoming, which was a favorite phrase of my teacher, Jean Klein, is really a key part of this process. For those of us who have experienced trauma and do experience ways in which we are triggered, the trauma is triggered in the present moment, the important part is, again, welcoming and having compassion for ourselves, to embrace all of our experience just as it is, not thinking it should be different. See, in a certain way, we may have this idea that, if you're awakened, you have everything together, I've got it all together. This is an image that people have in spirituality just as well as in everyday life, but it's actually quite the contrary. Let it all fall apart, It's not about holding it together. It's about embracing it and welcoming it just as it is, with all its chaotic, fragmentation and non-integration and all kinds of things arising, this idea that we have that we're all supposed to look like Ramana in his room there, lying in timeless tranquility. I think it's important to let go of the pictures of how it's going to look. For you and for me and for each of us, it's going to look different than it's looked for anyone else. Your path is unique, and I encourage you to embrace your path, welcome your path, your particular unfolding, just as it is, without expecting it to be different. There's a sense often of a kind of groundlessness, right? And, groundlessness is not a bad thing. Groundlessness is actually the nature of reality. There's a wonderful, some of you have heard me say this perhaps, Trungpa Rinpoche, who was a kind of crazy Tibetan teacher who was also brilliant, who I had the good fortune of studying with, said, the bad news is you're falling through space without a parachute. The good news is there is no ground. Right? So that's the groundlessness. Yeah? There is no ground. We're falling through space, but to think that there's a ground we're supposed to land is the illusion. Okay? Life is just an endless falling through openness. You could say it's chaos, but as one great Zen master said, everything is perfectly managed in the unborn. Everything, there's a unique, implicit order that takes care of itself. You don't have to hold it together. You don't have to stay in control. You can trust, which is difficult for those of us who have been traumatized. We can trust that what seems like chaos has its own inherent order. So clearly, trauma is a great motivator, and it also invites us back again and again to this groundless ground, which is openness, which is presence. Right? No one controlling, nothing to control, no one experiencing, nothing to experience, just life living itself. That's the groundless ground. So to let go into that groundless ground is the ultimate antidote, you could say, to the experience, the reactivity that we experience, or the fixation of attention or the fragmentation, is to just rest, come to rest in awareness, boundless awareness, our true nature, whatever word we call it, however we find our way back. And at the same time, some additional work can be very helpful. Okay. At one level, everything is perfect just as it is, right? At the inherent level, the absolute level, the innate level. Each moment is complete and unique, precious, sacred. And at the same time, we aspire to reduce our suffering, to experience this oneness on a more ongoing way. Suzuki Roshi, one of my teachers, said, "You're perfect as you are, and you could use a little improvement." Right? So, this aspiration toward integration, I think, is part of the awakening process. And again, I think those of us who've experienced trauma have our own unique challenges, and most important is to really welcome them and embrace them. Huh? So anyway, that's some talk, a lot of talk actually, more than I'm used to giving in a certain way. But I now welcome your your thoughts, your questions, and let's see where the conversation goes, the dialogue goes. Okay. So Wesley, you have your hand up. I don't know. I'm not handling that. I think Sarah's handling that, right? So, yeah.
As we see best. Yeah, Wesley, you're welcome to ask a question.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you so much for this teaching, Stephen. It speaks to me on so many levels, more than I could easily articulate. It's really, really resonant for me. Very resonant. And I found you. I believe I found you through the Adyashanti website.
Sure.
I think that's where I first found out about you, and so I have a question, or kind of a reflection, but more with a question, and I think maybe to help frame it, Adyashanti, I don't know if it's his map or where he got that from, but I heard it from him, this idea of the head awakening, the heart awakening, and the gut
That's
awakening.
right. That's right.
You're familiar with that? Okay. And,
yes, that's sort of what I was talking about. But I was pointing to something a little different, but I think similar. Yes, we awaken the upper chakras, the sense of openness and spaciousness, and then it descends into the heart, and then it awakens this boundless love, and again, welcoming, right, from a deeper place. And then it's that, but then now what we've been talking about today is that the gut, you could say, lower chakras, yeah.
Yes, and you know, it's just a map, but it really seems to be accurate for what's happening in my experience, which is you know, real boundlessness, timelessness, clarity at the level of beliefs and thinking, and then these past months, just a very profound, I guess it's like heartbreak. It's like really profound opening, grieving, many things, moving emotionally, and it's been real intense, but really beautiful. And now, and this is my question, I come to this very dense and seemingly primal and seemingly very old energy in my gut, in my stomach, and you know, I'm doing EMDR currently. I experienced a near-death trauma a few months ago that kind of kicked this whole thing into high gear, and among other things, it opened up Kundalini energy, which I was not familiar with prior to this. So my nervous system has been very overwhelmed, and I'm finding as I open into the stomach area, it's just this storehouse. It's like every moment of pain, of loneliness, of trauma. There's so much in there. It's unbelievable how much is stored inside this body. My father was killed when I was 3, and so those are my earliest memories. And you know, just knowing what little I know about how trauma impacts the brain, and how kind of malleable and foundational those early years are. It kind of makes sense that there's a lot going on. And I was experienced a lot of emotional abuse, and anyways, I guess long story long, what I've been doing at this point is just deeper and deeper surrender. I'll lay down, and I've actually been spontaneously using that mantra, you are welcome here, you are welcome here, you are welcome here.
Beautiful.
So
beautiful.
Very much like that Rumi poem and what you're talking about. But what happens is I'm having a lot of energetic release from like old repressed fight or flight, and I get to this point of very, very deep, subtle surrender, and my body, it's not intentional, but the body stops breathing, and it's like something starts to release from the stomach, body stops breathing, and I get to where I'm about to black out, and there's just this panic, fear thing that kicks in, and I start gasping for air. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. The question's in there somewhere, but I'm not really.
Well, can you deliberately breathe? Open your. I mean, this is deliberate, of course. It isn't just allowing, but I'm wondering if you could just breathe into it as it's happening.
Yeah, that's ultimately what happens. Is I have to kind of willfully, I don't know who the I is, but something willfully takes over, and I have to start breathing. But I just hear about states of encountering death with this horror, or I don't know if I'm meant to just kind of let the body black out and face that, or I don't know, just it's this real awful situation.
Awful situation because it's so intense.
Yeah, and it's really unnatural to let your body kind of black out.
Well, you don't want to let your body black out. No, I don't think.
Yeah.
I would suggest actually letting the breath become fuller. Not forcing it, but just as you find, just suddenly, just breathe as it's happening, and just see what happens. I think you may find that there may be natural, and that you may, how should I say, allow a natural tendency to want to breathe. You're not pushing it, but the breath just simply may want to happen. I think when we get shorter breath, we naturally want to, So I'm wondering if you're holding your breath. You see what I mean?
I know. And every time I've brought this up to somebody, they've said the same thing, that, maybe this is super ego, or this is some kind of, but it's not, it really is, it's the opposite of intentional. It's like the deeper I surrender, then I come to this point where it's like, yeah, it does not feel intentional. I know it sounds like that.
Yeah. So it's hard to know. I mean, I'd probably have to sit with you and talk with you at some length to get a sense. We probably don't have time for that. But I'm wondering what surrender means to you. Surrender is a non-action, right? So if you're doing something to surrender, then that may also be something that's causing you to, lose your breath in the way that you are. There's a softness to surrender, right? A gentleness, a non-doing, right? So anyway, you may already be aware of this. I'm not sure whether this touches what you're asking. So, something to explore.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and really enjoyed being here. I actually have to get off now, but I'm glad I got to interact.
Very good, Wesley. Nice to see you. Here.
Next, Helena said she would like to ask a question. So Helena,
I'm sorry, someone named Mark.
Helen.
Okay.
Helen. Stephen, I think I've been contracted quite of my life, and didn't really realize the last week I've been in a flow state. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been in a flow state, and, it's just like everything comes together without controlling. I think I taught myself to control. And I'm just wondering, okay, if this is what I do, and I'm wondering if I'm bypassing a little bit, I bring as much love to my heart as I can. And when thoughts come up, I love to try to figure things out in my brain, but what I do is I just say maybe to those thoughts. Meaning,
Okay.
Meaning maybe they're true, maybe they're not, and then I can rest back into the spaciousness again. And
That's
then,
good.
oh,
Good.
okay, so that's not bypassing?
No, because that's the answer is maybe. Yeah, I mean, whatever the mind says, sure, maybe.
Because
that's the appropriate answer, right? I mean, it's true. Who knows? Really, what you're saying is who knows, right?
And, you know, because my mind usually tries to get a fixed position on every little thing, you know,
Right.
and so this way it's just like, well, maybe, okay, good. And then when the tough stuff has been coming in, I put compassion and just welcome, let me feel this. But then if it starts going in the storyline, I kind of go maybe to that too.
Okay, sure. Yeah, maybe is the truth. I mean, maybe. Any belief is maybe, it's not true or not true, it's just maybe.
And then, as you said, I feel like I'm falling. There's no place to rest. I'm in this open space.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful.
Maybe stops but Stephen.
That's one way to drop out of the mind, is to just, you can just see it for what it is. You see the belief and thought for what they are, or saying maybe is just another way of, you're acknowledging it, but you're not indulging it, simply. Yeah.
Thank you, because I didn't realize that there's another way. I mean, I'd have these openings for a week, and I thought, I thought the contracted way of life was the way it was, the normal way.
Well, yeah, it sounds like you've had this experience before where you saw the contraction, and maybe you're seeing it again at another level. It's like we see deeper and deeper how much we hold on and how contracted we are.
Oh, maybe that, okay. But even my friends say that I'm a control person. And so I guess last week when I was able to let go of the control, I realized, oh my God, things just work out by themselves. You know what I mean?
Yeah, how about that? Helen doesn't have to be there.
No.
For things to work out.
And there's a feeling inside that things are going to work out. But when I'm in the other state, of course, I don't feel that. It feels like I have to control. I have to put the effort in. Otherwise, things won't be done.
Right. And that's a fixation of attention, which is what we were talking about. And there's a continuum between, PTSD and normal neurotic reactivity. It's not a continuum. So we're all more or less traumatized, and we're all, fixated, and we're all trying to stay in control. So you don't have to be traumatized, this is the pattern. This is the ego, basically, trying to stay in control.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, Helen. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Helen. We have a question from Keith now.
Keith. Okay, and Mark raised his hand, so earlier. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Keith was letting me know before in the chat that he would like to Keith. I'm going to unmute your microphone now, Keith. I can't do it.
There.
Yeah.
Okay, how's that?
That's good.
Good. I want to keep my story brief so that it doesn't become, quote, my story, but I identified with trauma relatively later in life, sort of a late onset trauma. I'll just identify it briefly. It may be familiar to some, it may not be familiar to others. And it's a diagnosis that's known, a social diagnosis that's known as parental alienation syndrome. Namely, I became alienated from my son and from the ex-wife, and the whole situation I took on dimensions that Joseph Campbell would have found fascinating and Dante would have found fascinating in terms of a journey to the underground, the darkest period of my life. Because of my identity, I deeply, deeply identified with being a father. And for the first 12 years, I can even feel the emotion now. The first 12 years of his life, we were very close. And then, so in any case, I don't want to tell this. I don't want to tell the story. What part of the story though is the telling of the story is did not even have a trauma framework for this. So I was busily, desperately using every tool I had, including Vipassana meditation as I had learned it, which as I had learned it, and I actually have come to realize, I believe as I was taught it in that model of mindfulness that you've written about so well, Stephen, I had become a machinery of dualistic fixation. So my attempts to work with my thoughts by observing them and my feelings became an obsessive boom, 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 self, using self to get out of self as a self.
Right.
So, so what I want to relate this to what we're talking about today is I have had glimpses, recognitions of true nature. There's no doubt to me about that. And that all took place after my son, by the way, my son and I have had a reconciliation, and we're moving on. But in terms of the model you've presented, I have a hypervigilance that I seldom expect when he doesn't respond to a text of mine.
Sure,
oh,
sure.
he's still out of touch. What am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong?
Yeah,
So, yeah, so this is something that I would want to work on as time goes on, and it's a continuing process. If I could, I found a couple of very brief quotes that have helped me and relate to this topic, and I'd like to share them. They're truly very brief. By the psychologist James Hillman, who I have found extremely valuable over the years. The first quote is, quote, "Our lives are determined less by our childhood than by the traumatic way we have learned to remember our childhood." And what that says to me is how we remember the traumatic event in the present has a great impact in whether we re-traumatize, whether it's re-traumatizing or not, the storying of it. And the second quote is very similar by Hillman. "If you are still being hurt by an event that happened to you at 12, it is the thought that is hurting you now."
I don't agree with those, by the way. So maybe we'll talk about them some other time.
Yeah.
I would not agree with that, because I think trauma has a deep effect on the nervous system, and it's not simply cognitive.
Well, and I don't mean to say that but for the piece that is true for me in that is the way I tell it, and it is.
I think it's more than that, but it's okay. This is not a time to, I appreciate that. So yeah.
I have found it useful for myself in how I tell myself the story about what had happened.
Absolutely. I think the story has an impact, but I don't think it's simply sufficient to just see it as a story and let it go, because with trauma, it'll just keep coming back. Yeah. So, but I do think that seeing it as a story is very important. But with trauma, and that's the nature of trauma, which is why I'm talking about it here, is it is different from, in most cases, seeing it as a story would be sufficient. In many situations, seeing it as a story, you see it as a story, and then it doesn't have a hold over you anymore. With trauma, it's often deeply ingrained in the psyche, and just seeing it as a story is not sufficient. No, I don't want to have a conversation with you about it.
And I don't want to argue about the thought either. Where that works for me is recognizing that it's happening in the present now when I'm remembering. Yes. But that's the key, that all of the work that I'm still doing with the trauma, there is no past. The past is present right now when my son doesn't respond to me in a text, and I tell the full story about, the alienation is still in effect. That's the relevance of the quotes for me, not that it's just thought, but that everything is right now and right now present, including the brain issues that you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, of course that's true. Yeah, I just wanted to, really emphasize that, trauma is unique, and, I don't want people to have the impression just seeing it as a thought is sufficient. I think it's really important that we do recognize that it's a whole separate genre, you could say, a whole separate dimension of experience. So, but thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Because that's where.
Oh, Mark, Mark, I can see you unmuted.
Mark, yes. Where's Mark? Mark, okay. Hello? Mark? Can't hear you. Will I be able to see this question?
If you want to type a question, Mark. Maybe we can take another question and then wait for Mark to type.
Okay, let's take another question.
Colette, you like to
Go
ask
ahead.
a question?
Right. Hi. Hi, thanks.
Hi there.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Stephen. Thanks very much. I think another guy who's gone now has said that how relevant everything you've said, specific aspects which are really helpful. I've noticed these in the process of practice, and I'm being guided by someone, which is it's like a holding container. So I carry on that therapeutic. It's not therapeutic, but it's like I benefit from that connection. Absolutely. Rather than just doing this on my own. And I do have trust issues and all of the things that you said.
That's I just want to bracket that and say that's so important, that relationship. Again, if we didn't get that as a child, for example, or even if we did, but especially if we didn't, having that kind of a relationship, of a secure relationship with someone who holds our experience, helps us integrate it and listens, and it's so powerful, whether it's a close friend or a partner or a therapist toward healing trauma. So yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I really I can talk to my partner, my friends, and I even ask them, if I'm getting, if you notice that I'm getting a little bit wobbly, just feed that back to me. So I've got like a triangulation of help.
Yeah.
But what I wanted I wanted to ask a question, but what strikes me as well is the similarities between trauma and awakening. That sort of sense of groundlessness and like a sense where there is no sense, where there's something else happening. I can see that the similarities of those, except one's got a flavor. A slightly different flavor. But one of the things I've struggled with is I'm really slow compared to other people who are being guided at the same time, and I just don't get things as quick. And I think what I've experienced is a little bit like sometimes a fog that I feel like I can burn through, but so I wanted to ask about that. And I notice as I go through this process, I'm becoming more and more disorganized, and my memory, which was never very good to begin with, is like loads worse, and sometimes that worries me a bit. It's almost like the hypervigilance that I use to remember things is softened, and
okay, yeah.
But I'm a little bit concerned about that, because the kind of boundaries, the kind of things that hold you in your life that you must do in order to work, a little bit compromised, I feel. So the fog.
As the result of what? Of awakening, you mean, or
yeah?
What
the longer I focus on these practices, the more disorganized I would say I've become. I'm not a great organized person, but I feel I've become much less organized.
Practices? What practices are you doing? Yeah.
I've been looking at a series of fetters. There's 10, and I'm just making my way through them.
A series of what? I'm sorry, I didn't.
Fetters.
Fetters?
Fetters, yeah. Yeah, so there's no self-doubt, right and ritual, desire and ill will, subjectivity and objectivity, and so on. So, yeah, I'm being guided through those. And anyway, yeah. So, I don't know if the fog or the disorganization sounds familiar to you. Or...
Well, first of all, I'm not familiar with the practices you're doing, and different practices could have different effects. So so I'm not sure, but I mean, awakening itself can be disorienting because it jolts us out of our usual everyday way of seeing things. So, that can cause us to maybe be forgetful or a little disoriented, but I'm not sure about the memory. I can't really say about the connection, Yeah. Don't feel like, have enough information, shall we say.
Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. I wouldn't worry about it, of course, but I would certainly suggest not worrying about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be out of my control anyways.
Well, since it's out of your control, you might as well not worry about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not like you're doing something harmful, to yourself. Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with the fetters, but maybe I'll look into that a bit. Yeah.
I can see Mark has typed his question in the chat. Do you see it, Stephen?
I don't see a chat. Where's the chat? Oh.
Yeah. I want to ask about the intersection of Sangha, complex PTSD, and secure attachment. Oh, now actually Mark has written a longer version. Maybe you want to read it yourself. It would be easy.
I can't find it.
I'm in the chat. Do you see the chat window at the bottom of the screen?
Is my audio working now?
Yes.
I don't have it.
Yes, hi Mark. I can speak to now actually right now.
Oh. Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah. I hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have a chat window.
Yeah, basically I'm just thinking in terms of kind of the broader collective picture. And, I've been actually just this past week or two looking at, John's work, his new book, Richard's I Rest, and I'm even, geographically close to them. But the fact remains that really good therapists, especially with, a non-dual understanding, is relatively rare. And with complex PTSD, where there's this heavy social aspect and people may be really isolated, it feels like, we really need to look at Sangha. And
yes,
I just don't know how, I feel like it's just, we really need to think about that and talk about that because, there can be a very much, kind of an excessive inward looking focus when we're not really availing ourselves of this resource. And it seems like also, like with the non-dual community, you kind of show up to teachings, you might go to a retreat, but it's not necessarily the most socially engaged community, I guess you could say.
Absolutely.
So absolutely. I thought, I ask you about that and see,
I think that's a beautiful point. I think it's a beautiful point. I mean, I don't know, what to do about it, but I think it's absolutely true. I mean, in Buddhism, the three treasures, the three jewels are the teacher, the teaching, and the community, you know. And the community is a kind of holding environment. People with a shared understanding and a shared journey together support us in what we're going through. I think it is, I think it is unfortunate, really, that we don't have more of that. I don't know any solutions myself. There are, you know, around Ajah, there are little groups that gather and watch his videos, for example. I don't know how much that functions as Sangha, but yeah, I mean, to have certain, at least a small group of friends that share the journey with you would be very helpful. You know, something you may consider for yourself. How do I create that for myself? You know?
Yeah, I suppose just bringing it up might be helpful to just have that awareness out there to start with, and then there is a matter of kind of organizing something. I mean, sure. You know, kind of, you have this idea that, you know, it might naturally, you know, come about, but there needs to be, I think, a little bit of intentional action.
Sure.
It seems,
absolutely.
Yeah, we might become almost conditioned in a way to just identify with the teaching context. Whereas I think in a kind of group, if we want to say even a co-counseling kind of model, that would be a very different dynamic and a different focus with a you know, therapeutic focus, even, at least with a certain psychological savvy and understanding, which isn't necessarily going to automatically be there in, you know, a regular satsang, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's really a good point. I don't have any answers, but I totally agree with you. It would be lovely. Let's just say that it would be lovely if there were more community. And as you said, there's a tendency to be so inward focused, you know, and I think that community is so important. You know, I think in general, of course, in the United States certainly, and you know, most countries, there's a dearth of community and connection. So absolutely, I encourage you to do what you feel moved to do, to reach out and create a community. I mean, you know, one thing is if you go to satsangs, to connect with people there and you know, maybe create you know, virtual community, you know, not face to face, but you know, to be able to talk with people that you met at a satsang or a retreat. I think it's really a good idea. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I wish I had solutions, but I think, as you say, just talking about it is an important first step. See what happens.
Thank you,
I
Mark.
think Meredith.
Yeah, exactly.
Meredith. Sorry. Virtual hand up here. Okay.
Hello. This is amazing, and I've had a really nice, well, you know, it's been a triggering time, but it's been a nice time, and thank you so much for hosting this. My question is on the unique ways that people handle trauma differently. I found that, like, we are all connected to the one, but we also have like our individual experiences. You know, our soul is here learning something different, generally in Earth school, you know. And so my question is, there are people that experience trauma or the shadow self as a shrinking, as a becoming despondent, or like unresponsive, and that's how I found that I've been. I just become really noodly and, like, you know, and I've also found that there are people that do a different thing. They buck up and they're like, you know, and I guess I'm just wondering, like, is there different strategies for approaching each like style of holding pattern, and if so, what are they? Thank you.
Strategies for, say that again, strategies for how to deal with trauma? you're saying?
There are different strategies for dealing with like the different holding patterns, the noodle holding pattern versus the bucking up holding pattern. And
Right. I think the key is always awareness. Just be aware of your particular approach, you know, and not necessarily try to change it, but just to be aware of it. And again, if it seems appropriate, to get some assistance in working with the trauma, so that you're not being traumatized. I mean, ultimately, I mean, any of these holding patterns are, you know, helpful to a degree if they help you deal with the trauma when it's being triggered. But if, you know, that you find they're making you dysfunctional in some way, then, you know, one of the qualities that is talked about a lot these days in, you know, corporate counseling environments and in psychology in general is something called resilience. Resilience is a quality they've begun to measure now and to talk about. And resilience is actually one of the qualities that makes it, you know, whatever that is, whatever resilience is, it's one of the qualities that makes it easier to deal with trauma, you know. But is it something we can cultivate? I'm not sure. I think it's, some people seem to have more innate resilience than others. But I definitely think that relationship with, you know, a therapist or a close friend really helps. I mean, Mark was talking about that too. Relationships are very healing ultimately. You know, healthy relationships are very healing. We're not alone, because trauma by its nature makes us feel isolated and alone and disconnected. You know, we experienced it all by ourselves. There was no one else there. No one understands what we experience, you know. In fact, it's precisely the feeling of being all alone that is so traumatizing. Here we are all alone, you know, and this thing is happening to us and we have no one there to help us. If there was someone there to help us, it wouldn't be as or even at all traumatizing, you know. So isolation and disconnect are really an important aspect of trauma. And to heal that, I think connection is really important. And again, awakening is one way we connect, but I think also to connect with others is really important. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
And there was Beverly who wrote in the chat that she'd like to ask a question.
Beverly, yes.
Beverly.
Hi, Beverly.
So I just want to note that, I'm unmuted. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So you just talked about resilience and how that comes about. And you actually already told us, and I'll tell you why. I am a non-dual meditation teacher trained by Judith Blackstone. And about 3 years ago, after my training, and as I was putting up my website, I got very severely traumatized by an energy worker who actually replicated my mother's rejection of me in the womb. And we're talking complex, I had a childhood history of trauma and abuse, and then this happened. And so I'm dealing with severe PTSD, complex PTSD, and but my journey has been with a wonderful therapist who has been my person. And but what you talked about at the very, very beginning, bringing compassion and welcoming.
Yes, that's resilience.
Brilliant. That's resilience. Yeah. That's how over time, bringing compassion and welcoming to the triggers. And right. I got triggered from listening to what Keith was trying to explain as his experience of trauma. You know, for me to hear somebody say we discount the story is a trigger. And so I was able to actually use this so I didn't sit here and sink into the trigger or contract into the trigger, bringing an energy of welcoming and compassion to how I felt in that moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. You know, it's a process unto itself, this welcoming, because, you know, with really strong emotions, there on the one hand, there's the possibility of being swept away by them,
yes,
and overwhelmed by them. On
yes,
the other hand, the possibility of rejecting them, avoiding them, you know. But so it's a quality of presence, which I think, again, meditation is very helpful with. But I would say not necessarily mindfulness, because as someone mentioned, mindfulness can be very mechanical.
yes.
And we're talking welcoming. That is meditation. Meditation is welcoming.
Right.
That's ultimately what meditation is. You know, I mean, ultimately meditation is, there's no meditator, nothing meditated on, it's just what is. But, you know, at a relative level, welcoming is really what meditation is about. And so to welcome it without indulging it, without getting sucked into it, but at the same time not pushing it away. It's a high art, as Jean Klein likes to say. It's a subtle process, but it's really, really being with it, really being with the experience in the body, fully embodied, allowing it, welcoming it as it is, but not getting drawn into the identification. Seeing the stories as stories, but allowing the feelings. You know,
Right. It's
that's the process.
allowing the feelings is really the key. And I experienced this also, this trauma opened Kundalini for me. So I've got a lot of experience in the body all the time.
Yes.
So this compassion and welcoming is definitely that, and having a
right.
solid relationship. Yeah.
That's right. I totally agree. And if you come out, you know, everyone else, if you come out with only one thing from this, you know, the satsang, that's it. Yeah. Compassion, welcoming. Yeah. Put the Rumi poem on your refrigerator. Yeah. You know, it's a powerful. I also want to acknowledge Coleman Barks, who translated it. I think it's probably as much Coleman Barks as Rumi, but it's a beautiful poem. So, yeah, thanks, Beverly.
Beth would like to speak now.
Beth, yes.
Yeah. Should I unmute you, Beth? Yes.
Thank you.
There you are.
Hi. I was grateful. I think it was in your response to Keith about the story, and I think even without a story, there's damage. I mean, I grew up in an damage.
Yeah, no, I said that. I agree.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I grew up in an alcoholic family, and of course didn't even understand that till I was out of the home. I didn't think my dad was an alcoholic, and yet it did damage. And I believe it was emotional incest, which wasn't even a term, I don't think, at the time. And now I perceive that as being hugely damaging. And I've struggled with panic attacks and depression since college.
Yes.
This is over 30 years of a spiritual journey, as well as in and out of therapy. Right. And it's very wearying. And listening to different teachers has been very helpful along the way, as well as a meditation practice. But like right now, sometimes I hear the teaching and it's just so dry, and it doesn't really touch me in the same way it did, because it sounds like pounding somebody over the head with some kind of awareness logic that that's what you are, and let go of your story, and that's not real.
Right. Yeah.
And yet the feelings and the, you know, it's all just happening. And my conscious mind doesn't seem to really respond to logic, you know. I mean, doesn't seem to work.
I agree. Yeah.
And I guess I just, you know, you know, after 30 plus years of struggling with all this, I have had, you know, moments that were good, and I don't want to say it's all been bad, but it's very discouraging, very discouraging. And how do you keep going? How do you not just say, well, maybe this isn't for me?
So where do you feel stuck in the unfolding?
I think
Sounds like feeling stuck, or yeah.
recently, probably like a lot of shadow things coming up, which seems insane to me to happen in my 50s. When I've been in therapy on and off since my 20s, it's why now? I don't really know. But it's very hard, very hard.
So what I would, again, encourage you to do, and this is similar to what I was talking about, or this is sort of what I was talking about earlier, is it's like you have some expectation. It shouldn't be happening in my 50s.
Right.
How come this is in my 50s? I've done all this work. See, that's the point. It's like, this is precisely the time it does happen. And it happens when it happens. We have no control over the process. So it's like to really welcome your particular unfolding as it is. It's unique to you. There's no way it's supposed to be. There's no template. There's no, you know, there's no perfect model of what your journey is supposed to look like. This is your journey, okay? And so for you to just soften around that, let go of the judgments and say, this is just how it is for me. 50 is not so old, really. I'm a bit older, so 50 sounds great. 50, fantastic, you know. She's in her 50s, fantastic. So, you know, you've got these judgments of how it's supposed to look. This is precisely when it's supposed to start coming up. The shadow material is supposed to come up now. And you know why it is? Because it is. This is the perfect time. So welcome it. Again, not just with awareness, with the heart, right? With compassion. Welcoming has a warm quality to it, right? An open quality to it. You know, welcome it. This is what you need to be experiencing now. How beautiful that you're having the opportunity to have this experience now. You know? Okay, so however that you can know how to do that, bring that heartful compassion for yourself. Huh? Does that make sense?
It does. I think it's probably that perception of being a spiritual person, you know, for all this time, and then having, you know, all this time, you know, 30 plus years or whatever, and then having just rage, you know, and
right, man, how did that happen?
What, you know, what happened?
Yeah, exactly. But that's what I've been addressing this whole time, right?
Sure.
It's that particular mindset of it shouldn't be happening this way, you know. What's wrong with me? It should go this way. And what's, you know, wow, isn't that great? You get to experience rage. Now is the opportunity to work with that. Great opportunity, right? Some people can go their whole life without ever having to face that. Now you have an opportunity to work with it, you know. But there is no cookie cutter. There is no way it's supposed to look, you know. And if you say that it's felt dry, that may be a signal for you, you know, that maybe the way you're going about it is dry, and that you need to then bring more of your heart, you know, to do what we did today, which is drop down into the heart and open from the heart rather than opening from the head, right? Drop into the heart, allow yourself to feel that open, loving, welcoming quality of the heart, which is innate, and then allow it to just expand and open from there. You know, that has a very different quality. I remember when I practiced Zen, I left the Zen center. After 10 years, I was a monk, you know. I had to leave because my meditation became so dry. And then I, you know, fumbled around for a few years, and then I found Jean Klein, and got back on the journey again. Because clearly this was not a dry person. This was a man who was full of heart, coming from the heart. It was just beautiful. And so I would say, however you do that, find your way back to, or find your way down to the heart, and come from there. And particularly to welcome your own experience as it is. We're not in control of the journey, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. Yeah. We're being lived, Yeah. We're not in charge. Important to remember that.
I don't see any more questions for now.
We have about 5 minutes, so we can just sit a little bit. I think that would be lovely. So let's just, again, let awareness come to rest in the heart and just welcome whatever's arising. Whatever is arising in your experience now, just welcome it. I see that Michael is asking a question. Shall we? Sarah, you want to allow Michael to ask a question?
Yeah, Michael, let me unmute you.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me okay, yeah?
Hear you okay? Yeah, I'm trying to see you, but there you are. I don't
Wonderful.
see you, but yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to ask if you had any opinion or advice. I've heard a few times in your kind of academic texts and or in this type of environment, the notion of building the ego up after trauma in order to stabilize it before building it back down again for awakening. Is this something that you have an opinion on or any kind of guidance?
Right. There was, yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. There was a statement that was made in a book about 30 years ago. You have to be somebody before you can be nobody. Mm-hmm. So you have to build up the ego. No, I don't really subscribe to that notion. First of all, I would invite you to find the ego and show it to me. The ego really doesn't exist. The ego is just a set of patterns and learned behaviors and beliefs and stories, and so there's no such thing really as an ego as such. That's the whole point. There is nothing. So to build up the ego, I have no idea what that would mean, except of course some very kind of rigid theory of what an ego is, and how would you judge whether the ego is? It's all very mental. I know, at least from where I sit, and those who do that work maybe have a better understanding of what's involved, obviously, than I do. But it's not about building the ego. It's really about strengthening an inner holding environment, you could say. It's like the ability to be with our experience. And that's, I think, what needs to be, you could say, strengthened or cultivated or, practiced, is being with our experience, being present with our experience. And very often, people who have been traumatized have a hard time doing that, right? That's the problem. Yes. Hard to be with the experience. It's overwhelming. So in whatever way they can, to be supported in being able to be with their experience through a relationship with a therapist or someone else, or through developing presence, through meditation, or through an open, non-dual, non-judgmental awareness. I think that's what's most important, to be able to be with our experience.
Yeah, wonderful. That certainly sounds a lot more straightforward.
Yeah, and something we can relate to.
Yes,
right?
Yes. Yeah. Can I also just relate my experience to Beth's question previously? She was talking about things coming up in our 50s.
Right.
And something I found to be incredibly useful is to really notice that what's happening is really, for me, in my perspective, is part of the collective. So whether it's happening in your 50s, your 40s, or your 70s, it's really what's happening right now. And so I found that to be very useful to avoid any sort of sense of shame of not having completed or ticked off certain tasks by a certain point in time. Do you think that's acceptable?
So what are you saying? I didn't get the part about the collective.
Well, the notion that having not achieved a certain level of success in spiritual practice by a certain point in time, from my perspective, I think it's really much more my thoughts, your thoughts are really very much part of the collective experience. They're not necessarily individual, although they certainly seem to be. And so the idea that...
Yeah, you could say, I mean, I think in a broader perspective, really the key is that we're not in charge. We're not in charge of the process of awakening. We're not in charge of the process of integration. We're not in charge of the process of healing from trauma. We're not in charge. We just do what we do, and things unfold. And what do we know? We don't know. Where does the anger come from? Who knows? Why did it come up until now? Who knows? So it's happening the way it's happening because out of the mystery, that's the way it was meant to happen, and we just don't know why. Until we ultimately need to trust that, because we're not in control. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone. It's been lovely to be together. If you're interested in my work, you can check out my website, stephenbodian.org, and I also do counseling by phone or Skype. So if you're interested in that as well. But in any case, it's great to be together, and thanks so much. Okay. Be well.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for being with us, and thank you everyone for joining today. I just wanted to invite everyone to join Pamela Wilson for a 4-day online retreat that begins this Tuesday, and it's a 4-day online retreat. It's a really, really beautiful work, so I really recommend wholeheartedly, and hoping to see you online again very soon.
Very good. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a beautiful day.
Yeah, you too.